Hi, folks. I am so honored and grateful to be here virtually with you all at this super special event. If you haven't had a chance to go to devsforukraine.io/donate, or even if you have, and maybe you just found a couple extra coins between your couch cushions, every bit helps. So please consider giving. Thank you all so much for being here, and thank you so much to Sarah, Cassidy, and the remote organizing team for putting this event together. My name is Anjana Vakil. I am a senior dev advocate at Hasura, coming at you from San Francisco, California. And I would like to talk to you today about opening doors with open source. So as we think about making better futures for ourselves and for the people around us and our industry, really, I think to me what that means is opening doors and creating new opportunities, whether it's for our careers as individuals or for the companies that we work for or maybe have founded, or whether it is for the entire community that we're a part of, because none of us are doing this in isolation. So what I'd like to talk with you all today is about how open source can help create these open doors, these new opportunities for us to pass through and enter a bigger, brighter, more exciting, more successful future. So let's talk first about opening doors for your career with open source. So a tiny bit about me. As I said, I am a developer advocate and a software engineer before I got into dev advocacy. But before that, if we rewind several years, I was an English teacher, not at all had a background in computer science or tech. So what happened in the middle there? How did I get a foot in the door of the competitive, challenging tech industry? Well, around 2015, I encountered an amazing program and community called the Recurse Center. You can read all about it at recurse.com. This is a programming retreat, sort of like a writer's retreat, but for coders, that used to take place in New York City. Now it's virtual, but is a space where folks can come together and work on open source software as a way of advancing their learning journeys at whatever stage of their career that they're at. So there were folks like me just starting out. There were also folks who'd been in the software development industry for decades. And it was a really, really amazing introduction to the tech industry to be in a space working on open source software with a bunch of other really curious, motivated people who were really generous with sharing their knowledge and helping open those doors for newcomers like myself. And so while I was there, I found out about this amazing internship program called Outreachy. If you haven't heard of it, you can check it out at outreachy.org. This is a program that offers paid remote internships in open source to members of the tech community that come from underrepresented or marginalized backgrounds. And so in 2016, I was very lucky to do an Outreachy internship at Mozilla. And by working on open source software at Mozilla, some testing infrastructure for Firefox, I was able to really kickstart my career as a software developer. And without the open source ecosystem around that and the fact that it was a project that was accessible to me as someone of an outsider coming in and trying to learn more about this technology before I had gotten accepted into the internship, this was a really amazing way to get started, because the way Outreachy works is in order to get admission into the internships, you need to actually make contributions to the open source projects you're interested in working on. So this was a really amazing experience for me. And from there, that is how I got started as a professional software engineer. But what I also learned is that sometimes those open doors, they don't always come through the successful moments. Sometimes they come through the failure moments too. So I told you I had an Outreachy internship at Mozilla. What I didn't tell you is that 6 months earlier, because Outreachy internships run twice a year, 6 months earlier, I had applied to Outreachy as well, but I had failed to get in. I was rejected from that round of admissions. I wrote more about it on my very old blog that you can read about there, about what that experience was like. But suffice it to say that even though my first time applying to Outreachy, I didn't get in, I learned so much about making my first pull requests to open source repositories on GitHub, about communicating with maintainers, filing issues, having conversations, making connections with folks who are running these projects. And so even though I failed that round, it really helped me understand kind of the mechanisms of working on software, thanks to the fact that it was all open source and accessible to folks who were doing it, as an entry point into software development. And that helped me then have a stronger application 6 months later, which ultimately led to me getting an internship and then being able to work in the industry. So I also have learned along the way, as I think many of us have, that if you want doors to open to you, it also helps to be open yourself, to be open about what you're going through, what you're learning, your struggles also. And I think there is an amazing concept that has been talked about more and more called learning in public. And if you haven't seen the talks from Codeland Conf in 2021, Gift Egwenu gave a really great keynote about learning in public, with a shout out to Sean Wang, who has done some amazing writing and made some amazing content on the subject of learning in public. So I highly recommend that you check this out. And suffice it to say that the takeaway from a lot of folks who have made careers in this industry is that by sharing what you're going through as a learner, as someone trying to get into the industry, as someone trying to grapple with a new technology that's maybe different than the types that you've worked with before, by sharing those moments of frustration, those aha moments where it finally clicks, the things that you're struggling with, the open questions you still have, the things you have just learned and just wrapped your head around, that is a really, really great way to not only open doors for yourself, because you're talking about what you're interested in, what you're learning, what skills you've recently acquired, but also to help open doors for the next learner coming along behind you. So in a sense, to open that door for yourself and then hold it open as you're walking through. So please check out Gift's talk and Sean's writing on the topic. Now, the next thing that comes to mind then is, okay, once you're in the industry, you're working at a company, how can open source help open doors and create opportunities for a business as well? Is it just something that we're all working on for free that doesn't really have any correlation with the business world? No, I think the answer we can suffice to say, after several decades of seeing it roll out, open source is also something that creates a lot of opportunities for companies and for material success. So this is evidenced by the immense success in terms of acquisitions and IPOs of companies that are exclusively focused on open source technologies. Folks like Red Hat and MongoDB going for tens of billions of dollars, and even other companies like MuleSoft and Elastic, having valuations of multiple billions of dollars. There is money in open source. It has been demonstrated. And the thing is that, we think sometimes that economic interests and the open source world might be at loggerheads, but I think that we've seen that there can also be a positive feedback cycle between them. So when you're trying to build a product or a service that you want to succeed in a space of developers in software, you're going to be doing some development on that. And if that development is happening in open source, then you're going to have developers falling in love with your product and adopting it because they can try it out without a lot of commitment. They can try it out for free. They can poke around in the code base. They can modify it for their particular use cases. They can communicate with the project team. They can file PRs to add features that they need. They can raise bugs as issues, etc. And so you're going to really accelerate adoption of your product if it is out there in the open for developers to play with. And then, of course, as developers are adopting it from the open source perspective, they're going to start recommending it to their teams to take on in a commercial context. And that means commercial success for your company that's putting this open source software out there. Now, the thing is, if you stop there, and if your company maybe isn't even making the open source software, but is actually relying on open source projects for the technology that you offer to the world, if we stop with just that kind of one directional flow from development to adoption to profits, not only do we have kind of the ethical concern of maybe just profiting off of other people's free labor, of folks who have just donated their nights and weekends to building out these open source projects, but also there's kind of a ceiling put on how much commercial success your company is going to have if that is kind of the end of the line. Whereas if your company invests back into the open source products, whether they're products and services that you're developing within your team, or whether they are wider ecosystems of technologies that your company relies on, investing back into that community, into that development process, lending resources to help make that open source software better is going to drive more adoption, because you have better software with more features, fewer bugs, etc., which is going to drive even more success for the company, which means you can put more into the community, and so on and so forth. So we get this real virtuous cycle, as it were, a positive feedback cycle through this process. And I think one example of this really working is from the company that I recently joined, Hasura. Hasura makes an open source GraphQL engine that essentially lets you have an instant GraphQL API on top of your data. So it connects to several different types of data sources, databases, other APIs, and essentially offers a instant unified GraphQL API on top of them. And this GraphQL engine is open source, which means there can be a whole kind of community around trying this out, communicating back with the team about what's working, what's not working, contributing features sometimes, or contributing code fixes. And this means that the product just gets better and better, which means the adoption gets larger, which means the company has more customers in the end as they move from using the open source tool into using it in a commercial or professional enterprise context. And at the same time, this GraphQL engine is founded on two other open source projects and communities, GraphQL, as is perhaps evident, and Haskell. The engine is written mainly in Haskell. And so these two projects, Hasura has also been reinvesting in. Why? Because, well, as these two projects advance, so does the technology that Hasura builds that is on top of these projects. So by reinvesting in these communities, reinvesting in the folks who are maintaining these technologies, reinvesting in folks who work with these technologies to improve the processes, to improve the Haskell compilers, or to flesh out, prospective features and proposals and things like that in GraphQL, that means that contribution into those communities is ultimately going to cycle around and come back to the company and its business motivations. So you can read more on the Hasura.io blog about Hasura's work with the GraphQL and Haskell communities, if you're interested in hearing more details about that. Another great way that open source can open more doors for your company is when you make the materials, for example, your documentation, your tutorials on how to use your products, open source. That means that the community of learners who is trying to grapple with using your open source product can also contribute back to those materials and help make it easier for other learners to come along and get to know the systems that you've built and the open source tools that you're hoping folks adopt more often. So for example, at Hasura, we have this series of tutorials at hasura.io/learn. There are some really great tutorials on general concepts such as introduction to GraphQL or database tutorials or tutorials about using GraphQL in various front-end frameworks. And of course, some tutorials about using Hasura's open source products. But all of these tutorials are open source and freely available on GitHub. So when you're taking a course, like for example, this is the Intro to GraphQL course that we're looking at here, you'll see an Edit on GitHub button on each page of that tutorial. So if you find something that's confusing or could use a little more explanation, you can raise that as an issue on GitHub. If you see a typo or a sentence that's worded in a maybe misleading way, you can fix it. You can submit a PR. And in so doing, you can open the door for more folks to have more success with these tutorials, which also means for the company, by opening up these materials, the community is able to help each other out and make it a better learning experience, a better experience of using the documentation, etc., for other folks in the community. And by that same token, it's a really great way to have your content reach a wider global audience. For example, you'll notice here that these tutorials exist not just in English, but also in other languages like Spanish, Chinese, and Japanese. Some of these being really recent additions, and all driven by the community. So when you make the documentation and tutorials around your products open source, you can have the community itself help you reach a wider audience, a wider net of developers who might be interested in adopting your tools. And that, of course, is going to create more opportunities, open more doors for your company and the business that you're trying to run. And that's because I really think that, it's cool that we build software. Like, that is a really cool thing. And even better, I think some of us might agree, than building software is building open source products. But the really galaxy brain level here is not building products, whether they're open source or not, but building community around the tools that we use. Because when you're investing in a community, you are investing in the sustainability of those tools. When there is a community surrounding an open source project, that is going to make it survive past the original creator or the original maintainers. And when there is a community around the open source tools that your company either puts out there or relies on for the proprietary technology that you build, by investing in those communities and supporting those communities, you are supporting the foundations on which your company is going to be able to have success. And strengthening those foundations is going to create more and better opportunities in an economic sense as well. And so that brings us to the last kind of take I want to think about with you all here, which is how we can open doors and create more opportunities for the communities that we operate in as developers and as humans. So I don't know if folks have had a chance to check out the GitHub Octaverse reports. The state of the Octaverse reports that GitHub puts out are really fabulous look at open source ecosystems and open source developers, and have some really excellent takeaways that we can apply in our own projects and in our own communities. So in their latest 2021 report, one of the focus areas that they reported on was supporting sustainable communities. And in light of supporting communities, they laid out several observations and, in a sense, recommendations for how we can support communities in being more sustainable over time in the open source world. So I just want to take a look quickly at a few of the points that they raised in that report. And you can check out all the details at octaverse.github.com. And before we go on, can we just take a moment to appreciate this statistic? So in the 2021 State of the Octaverse, they found that there are over 73 million developers on GitHub total. But what I think is truly amazing is over 16 million of those are new users in 2021. Now, that might not mean that all of these people are completely new to software or to open source. Maybe they're just new to GitHub as a platform, but even so, that is a huge chunk of the developer ecosystem out there in the GitHub universe that is brand new. So we should be thinking, how can we make more opportunities for a community that has such a huge proportion of newcomers in it? And one way that GitHub pointed out is a really great lever for helping a community be sustainable is mentorship. So they point out that mentorship is a community asset, both in open source projects and communities and within companies as well. And so Outreachy, for example, which I told you about earlier, the internships that Outreachy runs are all mentored. So as an intern, you have a dedicated mentor who is there for you to ask questions, there to give you guidance, there to help you get unblocked. And that mentorship relationship is what really makes it such a pleasant and fluid experience to pass through that open door and get into the new project or new field that you are working through. And for example, when I participated in Outreachy at Mozilla in 2016, my mentor, Maya Friedrichowski, had been an intern herself several years before, and so was able to kind of pass down that gift of mentorship, or pass it forward, as it were. And so that's something we can all be thinking about, is how can we contribute back? How can we, you know, if we have time and expertise and we have a willingness to support the community, how can we help mentor others? And how can we also position ourselves as mentees to find new opportunities by talking to different folks, perhaps further ahead in their career or perhaps in different fields that we can learn from? And so I recently learned about another really great initiative called Tupu. Tupu.io is a mentorship network that aims to offer free mentorship to folks from marginalized communities, such as women, people of color, and LGBT folks. And so this is a network that you can join either as a mentor or as a mentee, or both. And so if you are interested in joining a network of folks trying to give back and make more connections through that mentorship relationship, check out tupu.io. Okay, the second point that was raised in the Octaverse report is that trust and respect contribute to a really strong culture. In open source, I think it is really important because we have this, you know, hugely open project that is accessible to folks from all over the place with all types of backgrounds who are coming at it from all different perspectives. It's really important to have some foundation for building that trust and respect so that the community can be sustainable. And so having a code of conduct for contributors or some kind of ground rules for how your community should interact and how interactions around everything from pull requests and issue discussions to meetups or in-person gatherings or virtual gatherings, having clear rules of the game to ensure that trust and respect is really important. So if you haven't seen Contributor Covenant, this is a really great project that offers a open source, open license code of conduct for open source communities. So it's a really great starting point. If you haven't implemented a code of conduct for your community yet, this is a really great starting point. So I would highly recommend any maintainers out there or folks who are working at companies where you do have open source public facing projects to check out Contributor Covenant if you don't already have a code of conduct or contributor guidelines in the social sense to ensure trust and respect. Please, please, please add those, and Contributor Covenant is a great way to start. And the last point that I want to talk about from the Octaverse report is essentially that the safer and more welcoming a community feels, the more comfortable and the more attracted newcomers are going to feel. And that means the more contributions that project or that community is going to get. So basically, the more that you make your project something that even somebody brand new can come in and contribute to, the more sustainable and the more successful that community and that project is going to be. So there is a really great project called Open Gates Checklist. You can check it out at opengates.dev that essentially provides what they call an anti-gatekeeping checklist. And it is geared towards content more generally, but I think it totally applies as well to open source projects. And it is a really great way of kind of ensuring that you're not doing things or instituting practices or using language that can make newcomers not feel welcome or make folks from different backgrounds not feel welcome. And so by running through a checklist like this, or maybe you make your own checklist from the learnings you've had from your own community, by making sure that you are evaluating how much your language and your guidelines and the tone and the content that your community and your project is putting out there, by evaluating how much those are welcoming and not gatekeeping, you can really ensure that you have a more sustainable, more successful project and a more successful, sustainable community with more opportunities created for the folks within it. Excuse me. And that's because this notion of gatekeeping, I think we're really past it. This notion that you have to be, you know, some sort of wizard or expert in order to participate in open source, or that if you don't have 10 years of experience with this technology, you can't make a useful contribution. Those gatekeeping notions, we're done with. Drake is done with them. Instead, we should be thinking about how can we not keep these gates up, but rather break them down. So instead of gatekeeping, let's try to focus on gate breaking, on really making sure that these gates come down once and for all, and that again, for every door that we open, we're holding it open for the folks who come behind us to walk through as well. So that is it for me. Thank you so much for being here with us today. And again, huge thank you to the organizing team of Devs for Ukraine. And again, please make sure if you have the means to visit devsforukraine.io and give whatever you can. Thank you so much.